Greetings. Let me begin this short video by quickly wishing everyone a Happy New Year, according to the Gregorian calendar. Now, I know the popular Western New Year is controversial within certain Bible-affirming circles on the grounds that it lacks biblical support and, moreover, as some would claim, that it's also even contradicted by the Bible. So with that in mind, I'd like to briefly explore that topic in this video. It is certainly the case that the Bible does not even mention the month of January, much less state that the new year begins in that month. However, I would raise this question. Does that mean that one is not allowed to celebrate a new year in January? Some out there argue that Exodus 12:2 precludes the possibility of a new year starting in any month other than the month of Abib, also called Nisan. Henceforth, I'll refer to it as Nisan. So, if you look at that verse, Exodus 12:2 in popular English translations, it does seem to clearly say that the relevant month is the beginning of months and the first month of the year. So what are we to make of this verse? It is interesting to note that how modern minds working with an English translation interpret Exodus 12:2 is not the same as the way that ancient Jews understood that verse. For example, in Josephus's Antiquity of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 3, he argues that when Genesis 7:11 refers to the second month, it actually means the month of Marsuane. And here I should introduce a quick technical note. When Josephus says Marsuane, he's referring to the same month, which is called Marcheshvan in modern Israeli Hebrew. The somewhat different pronunciations represent different vocalizations of the same consonantal structure. But pronunciation aside, this would be the second month if one starts counting the months from Tishrei, which is the month in which Rabbinic Judaism happens to hold the popular Jewish holiday called Rosh Hashanah, which is popularly understood to be the Jewish New Year. In short, Josephus was stating that when Genesis 7:11 refers to the second month, it was not starting the count at Abib or Nisan. He explicitly states that this was according to an older system which predated what came about in the time of Moses. Josephus goes on to state that in the time of Moses, Nisan, i.e. Abib, was introduced as the first month for certain matters, but the older system was retained. In other words, Josephus is stating that continued use of the system which begins the count at Tishrei was permitted by Moses. The introduction of Nisan as a first month was a start to the year under one system, but it was not the only system in place, thus making room for multiple starts to the year or multiple organizations of the year. If the idea of multiple systems for starting and organizing the year strikes you as odd, consider a modern analogy. Today, one can have a fiscal year and a liturgical year and a school year and so on. Now, these systems all follow the same calendar, but they begin and end at different points on that calendar. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it's a soft or a rough analogy to give you an idea of what's being employed within ancient Jewish thought. Interestingly, aside from Josephus, another ancient Jewish source takes the same approach, essentially. At the start of Tractate Rosh Hashanah, in the Babylonian Talmud, it is stated that there are 4 starts to the year. One in Nisan, another in Tishrei, another in Shvat, which will come up later in this video, and so on. Now, I realize that invoking the Talmud will give some hives. The people will just have a visceral reaction to mention of the Talmud. So, as a disclaimer, I'm not endorsing the Talmud as authoritative. Nonetheless, I would submit that it's representative of certain schools of ancient Jewish thought. By appealing to Josephus and the Talmud, we see that ancient Jews did not understand Exodus 12:2 the way that certain modern minds do. Of course, some of those who appeal to Exodus 12:2 might respond, who cares what Josephus or the Talmud said? They'd probably say the Bible is clear enough. So with that sort of reply in mind, or anticipating that sort of reply, I'd like to ask this question. How clear is the verse in Exodus? Now, it may be worthwhile to explore the Hebrew text rather than limit ourselves to an English translation, as surely ancient Jews like Josephus or the various Talmudic sages were not going by your preferred modern English translation. The text on your screen is the Hebrew text of Exodus 12:2. I've highlighted in red where all the explicit definite articles appear, and this is relevant. I've also put in a square the words Rosh, Rosh, which means head or start, and the word Rishon, which means first. Now, note that the definite articles do not appear before either of those words. So, on the first two lines, the verse declares, HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chadashim, literally, the month of this, or this month, is to you a start of months. The lack of a definite article before the word rosh means that we are not required to read this as meaning the start of months, but rather it can mean simply a start of months. So too, on the bottom two lines, the phrase, the statement, Rishon hu lachem lechadshe hashana, means it is a first to months of the year. Again, the lack of a definite article means that we are not required to read it as meaning it is the first of months. Rather, it can simply mean it is a first of months. It is a start of months. So this raises a question for those who appeal to Exodus 12:2. If the Hebrew text does not necessitate the reading that Abib or Nisan is the only possible start to the year, and if ancient Jews recognize multiple starts to the year, why should one side with your personal private interpretation of an English translation of the verse? Food for thought. That being covered, I would now like to turn to the Roman calendar. For those who do not know, the Roman calendar used to be lunar, or technically lunar solar, like the Hebrew calendar. It only switched from a lunar calendar to a solar calendar with the calendrical reforms of Julius Caesar just before the dawn of the Common Era, just before the, basically the last half of the 1st century BCE. Now, also worthy of note, the first month on the old Roman lunar calendar was originally March, which is the first month of spring. But the Romans later adopted a practice of starting the year in January. However, that practice also predated the Julian calendrical reform. In other words, the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that when the Romans first started celebrating a start of the year in January, or Januarius, it was on a lunar calendar. It was January according to a lunar calendar. Keep that in mind. I mentioned that to get to this next point. On the old Roman calendar, the Ides of March lined up with the Passover of the Hebrew calendar. Now, I'm referring to the old Roman lunar calendar. And in that case, the Ides of March lined up with Passover on the Hebrew calendar. In other words, both were right around the full moon of the first lunar month of the spring. That becomes relevant because if, on the old Roman lunar calendar, March corresponded to Nisan, that would mean that Januarius, or January, corresponded to the month of Shvat. Why is that relevant? Well, recall the multiple starts to the year, which was mentioned in the Talmud, which was touched on earlier in this video. One of those starts to the year was on the 1st of Shvat. Now, I want you to think about the implication there. One of the starts of the year recognized by ancient Jews was in Shvat, and Shvat corresponds to the month of Januarius, or January. This would mean that while modern minds might feel that a new year in January is alien to Hebrew thought, it actually worked within the logic employed by ancient Jews. Or to put it another way, our modern practice of starting the year in January actually has roots in a practice which paralleled an ancient Jewish practice. For me, that's fascinating. Interesting enough, the Talmud even goes on to describe that particular start as a new year for specifically trees, a new year for trees. As by that point in Palestine, a decent portion of the rainy season had taken place. And commentators on that Talmudic text have added further that this means the process of the later blooming of those trees was already nascent. It had already begun. The growth had already begun because a significant portion of the rainy season was completed. And this is interesting for people who try to pretend like it's just intuitively obvious that the new year should start in the spring. Not according to ancient Jewish thought. If anything, if you're basing it on growth, it could start when that growth was beginning. And it's interesting that the Talmud makes an allusion to that point, that ancient Jewish thought made an allusion to that sort of point. Before closing, I want to briefly address the polemic that argues that January is named after the Roman god Janus, or Janus, as people would say in English, and furthermore argues that celebrating the start of the year in a time frame which is called January in English amounts to worshiping that ancient god, that ancient Roman god Janus. Personally, I think the argument is weak. It's honestly on par with saying that if your Sabbath overlaps with a day called Saturday in English, that means you're holding that Sabbath constitutes worshiping Saturn. The logic is really that poor, to harp on the alleged etymology of these words in such a way. Nonetheless, I would note that in Macrobius's ancient book Saturnalia, he says that those who worshipped Janus as father and god of gods saw every month as dedicated to Janus. This begs a question then. If people start the year in March instead, would they still be worshipping Janus? Because keep in mind, there were people who dedicated the month of March to Janus. Or might they be worshipping Mars instead? Noting that the Roman calendar was once lunar, even if one were to go by a lunar calendar, they are still going to wind up on dates corresponding to dates on the old Roman lunar calendar. But that begs a question, does that necessarily mean you're worshiping deities who shared a name with the months, or the names of the months on the Roman calendar? It's worthy of note, worthy of pondering. If the polemic is rooted merely in the name used by the Roman calendar, what then are we to make of Palestinians, Syrians, and others who employ a corresponding solar calendar but call this month Kanun Athani instead? If you don't call it Januarius or January or whatever, and instead you call it Kanun Athani, does that mean you're no longer worshipping Janus? Likewise, are we to assume that those Jews who recognize the start to the year in the month of Shvat were secretly worshipping Janus? Again, the logic seems very poor, and to harp too strongly on the terminology it's to strain at gnats, honestly. It's worth noting that the gods from the Greek and Roman pantheons often evolved out of a tendency to personify something from the devotee's environment and then to make that thing into a god. For example, naming a star or a planet or a constellation and then building a story about a deity of the same name on that constellation or planet or whatever. Or for another example, the word for cereal, when you have cereal for breakfast, that word is actually etymologically related to the name of a goddess of agriculture, Ceres, also called Keres or Cheres, but Ceres. And though that goddess concept was itself probably the result of a personification and deification of grain. So I mention this because the word Ceres, just like the word cereal, doesn't necessarily begin with the goddess. It might actually go back to the grain, and the reason why it shares a name with that goddess is because of this personification of agriculture and grain. And that raises a question which I suspect cannot be answered with extant evidence, but nonetheless, here's that question. Was the month of Januarius necessarily named after the god Janus? Or was it based on some entity in the devotee's environment upon which the story of Janus was also built? While we can speculate either way, the fact of the matter is that we cannot say for certain, as we do not know who first coined the term Januarius. It's purely speculative. Moreover, note that the related word Janua in Latin means door or port or gate, etc. It's actually from where we get the English word janitor from. It comes up many times in the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, which served as the Bible of the Western Church for a millennium. For example, Deuteronomy 11:20 reads in part, "Scribas ea superpostes et Januas domus tue." Write it upon the posts and doors, Januas, of your home. Similarly, James 5:9 declares, Ecce judex ante Januam assistit. Behold, the judge stands before the door, Januam. In closing, I would sum it up this way. The Bible does not restrict us to only one possible start to the year. Ancient Jewish thought rightly recognized that the biblical text made room for multiple possible starts to the year. The practice of holding a new year in the time period called Januarius or January or whatever, Kanun Athani, is an ancient practice with roots in, or at least parallels in, ancient Hebrew thought. The specific name of that time period is not really relevant. Now, I would remind viewers that Romans 14:5 states the following, quote, "One person considers one day more important than another, while another person considers all day alike. Let everyone be fully persuaded in his own mind. Whoever observes the day observes it for the Lord." End quote. And similarly, or on a related note, Colossians 2:16 says, quote, "Let no man judge you with respect to a festival or holy day. And I'm paraphrasing, actually, not quoting directly, end quote. Now, we can discuss this more in the comment section, but for now, I will again wish everyone a happy new year.